Welcome back to our study through the book of Genesis. Today we're going to be in Genesis chapters 34 through 36, and we're going to especially focus in on chapter 35. So in chapter 35, we see Jacob and his family traveling back to his home, back to where Isaac, his father, is, and on the way there, they stop through Bethel. And as they approach Bethel, which is a place that we have seen throughout the book of Genesis, is a place that Jacob and God have met. That God has revealed himself, and Jacob has even declared his belief and his faith in God there. And in Bethel, as they're approaching the city, he looks around and he tells all of his family and his servants, he says, hey, remove your idols. Remove all of the gods of your father. As Rachel and Leah were from a pagan background, and they would have generally had a god or an idol with them. So Jacob, he tells them to remove all these things because they were approaching the presence of the Lord. I think this is one thing that we need to look at today and say, what idols do we have in our life that we need to remove, that we need to take away in order that we give proper worship to God? Because Jacob knew that the only way to properly worship God is by putting him first and making him the only God, that he was the only one that was priority. He was the only one that we look to in worship. And as we go through this text, we see again in verse 3, as Jacob describes what the Lord means to him, that he says that God had always answered him in times of distress, that he was always there for him, walking by his side. And I think these two characteristics of God are still as true then as they are today. And we can have great comfort in that. We can have great peace in knowing that God is there for us when we're in distress, that when we're worried and when we have problems in our lives, he answers our prayers, that he is there to hear what we have and the issues that we have. And the second thing is that God was always with him. Even when Jacob, whose name means trickster, who was unfaithful, who was not always following God correctly, that wasn't always following God with his whole heart, God was always there with him. He was always there walking by his side. I think this is a huge encouragement for me and you today, that even when we are faithless, he remains faithful. He remains there for us, and he remains there to comfort us. I think we can look at this and we can have peace and comfort in this during these hard times. And as Jacob and his family, as they approach Bethel and actually get to Bethel, God meets Jacob there. He tells Jacob, he says, you shall be blessed. You are going to be the father of many nations, just like he had told Abraham and Isaac before him. This passing on of the blessing, this passing on of the covenant to Jacob just shows the favor that God has Jacob and with his family. And we see that the Lord will be with him and bless his family. And he tells him to be fruitful and multiply, just like he told Adam in the beginning of Genesis. And we see as Jacob just continues on, he builds this pillar. He builds this monument to God to remember what the Lord has done, to remember the favor that God has on him and the promises that he has continually kept to Jacob. And as we look at this story of Jacob and his relationship with God, I think we can learn a lot from that last thing, that memorializing that moment that God was with him, that God promised him that he would be blessed. And Jacob said, I'm going to not forget this day. Because me and you, I think, can often forget how the Lord has worked in our lives. We can obviously look and see that he has worked in our lives, but we tend to forget this in difficult and trying times. And what Jacob does here is say, I will never forget this moment. I will never forget this time when the Lord was with me, when the Lord blessed me. And I think for me and you today, we need to take note of that. And we need to look and see, how can we memorialize what God has done in our lives? Maybe that means to write down in a journal the promises that God has kept to you and just how he has moved in your life, because we can easily forget. The beautiful story that we see here is that God is faithful, that he loves his children and that he is there with them, that he will not leave them or forsake them. And just as the God of Jacob, he is still our God today, and he does those things. He is still there for us. He still cares for us, and he is still faithful to love us.